just over 8,000, reported the wounded and exhausted Military Tribune, words spoken with a measure of despair in his voice, informing the count to his new commanding officer, Publius Cornelius Scipio, who, although was technically of an equal rank, and the youngest of the tribunes in what had been the largest Roman army ever assembled, just moments ago had been elected their leader in a unanimous decision by the battered survivors within the camp. Scipio, for the briefest of moments, while expecting a low figure, couldn't help but let his stern mask slip, rocked by the number. Only 8,000 out of the original 86,400. All that was left after having met with utter disaster on the battlegrounds of Cannae earlier in the day. And now, as the sun began setting overhead on August 2nd, 216 BC, left trapped within the wooden walls of the lone standing Roman encampment. Knowing that no one was coming to save them, their senior leadership annihilated, and hours since any more survivors had managed to stagger their way back to the camp. His expression quickly hardening once again, nodding in thanks to the tribune who had brought him the dire news, as Scipio began heading towards one of the watchtowers to survey the surrounding landscape before the last fleeting minutes of daylight died out. Walking through the encampment built for a much larger number, occupied now only by those 8,000, all of whom were fatigued and bloodied, wholly demoralized, many with traumatized, despair-filled eyes, trying to come to terms with the carnage they had just witnessed. And yet, despite the bleakness of their situation, moreover, the very future of the Republic hanging precariously in the balance, the 20-year-old Scipio, carrying himself with the reassuring presence and wisdom of a veteran commander, climbing up to the top platform of the wooden watchtower, allowing his sharp eyes to scan the horizon, seeing the Roman encampment across the Aufidus River, directly to the south of this one, in a smoking heap, ransacked and burnt to the ground by the Carthaginians, with his gaze then lingering upon the grounds west of the ruined Roman camp, watching as the setting sun started to cast a shadow over the main battlefield, covering the tens of thousands of Roman dead. Scipio shook his head to clear out the creeping emotional turmoil, since his vantage point also revealed a much more pressing concern: the movement of Numidian cavalry and Carthaginian light infantry units circling around them, like vultures waiting to feast, keeping watchful tabs on his trapped men, knowing what would be coming for them the next day, and that their fate too would be sealed if they remained at the camp, massacred or taken into captivity. How could the Republic possibly recover from this disaster? The question on his and everyone's mind, wrestling with this and the butchery they had just witnessed, amidst the miserable situation they now found themselves in. However, with Scipio again, forcing himself to push all of this aside for now, focusing on the task at hand, as a plan of escape began to formulate in his mind, marking the hills to the north of Cannae as the key to their flight. Because, although he knew that darker times were most certainly laying ahead for the Republic, the young commander, by force of his will and next actions, regardless to the odds, would prove himself unwilling to give in to the despair, determined to do whatever in his power to see to it that Rome would indeed rise again. Welcome to the Warlords of History podcast, and to part 5 of the series on Scipio Africanus. I'm your host, Mark Pimenta. Now, almost 2 years into Hannibal's campaign, since he had brazenly led his army through the Alps, invading northern Italy in October 218 BC, bringing the Second Punic War to the Roman Republic on its home soils. Nearing its zenith, and the focus of this episode wherein we'll be delving deep into the Battle of Cannae, fought on August 2nd, 216 BC, unpacking the layout, tactics, and circumstances that coalesced to produce Rome's greatest defeat, and, under no uncertain terms, what would amount to one of the most decisive encounters in the whole of military history, that continues to be studied by military academies to this day, and that Dwight D. Eisenhower, when Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War II, once wrote, "Every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation. So far as conditions permit, he tries to duplicate in modern war the classic example of Cannae." However, for our story here, this beginning with the 20-year-old Scipio, newly appointed as the youngest of the military tribunes within the ranks of the largest Roman force assembled up to that point in time, an incredible army of 86,400, bearing down on Hannibal and his just over 50,000 strong Carthaginian army, awaiting their arrival at Cannae, Apulia, in southeastern Italy, exploring what Scipio would have seen and experienced upon reaching the river plains east of Cannae, in the sweltering summer heat of late July in the region, including the simmering dissension between the two consuls for 216 BC, sharing supreme command over the entire Roman army, Scipio's father-in-law, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and Gaius Terentius Varro, in particular, disputing over the geography and layout of the impending battle site, grounds that, like he had done at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene to a devastating effect, Hannibal had carefully pre-selected in order to optimize the strengths of his army while neutralizing the tactics and numerical superiority of the Romans, while incessantly harassing and applying pressure on the Romans, doing things like impeding their access to water to get them to commit to a full-dress battle. Leading up to the fateful day on August 2nd, 216 BC, when, despite Paulus's objections, Varro gave the order to march the Roman army in field, the point at which we'll examine the formations and tactics utilized on both sides, before in detail picking apart what happened over the course of this 6-hour battle that would not only cement Hannibal's reputation as one of the greatest generals of antiquity, but also as the source of the Roman Republic's greatest existential threat, including the key moments and maneuvers that led to the enormous Roman army becoming completely enveloped, subject to a horrific slaughter on an unimaginable scale, resulting in a tremendous loss of life, upwards of 50,000 of the Roman army slain and nearly 20,000 taken prisoner. This, while a smaller scale battle was raging at the same time, just to the north of the main battlegrounds, that I suspect Scipio was involved in, as part of the 10,000 strong detachment sent to destroy the Carthaginian encampment, that too ended in failure. All of which, by the end of this darkest of days for the Republic, rendered Scipio trapped within the confines of the lone standing Roman camp, alongside another 8,000 beleaguered survivors of the calamity, surrounded, about to be resigned to the same fate, had it not been for Scipio, elected as the interim leader of the group, who devised a daring escape plan, that night, fighting their way through to the nearby hills, leaving the gruesome battlegrounds of Cannae behind, leading them to the safety of the nearby city Canusium, where Scipio, in another momentous event, another hint to his future greatness as a military commander and staunch Roman patriot, while some of his countrymen, overwhelmed by despair, began plotting, speaking of desertion, Scipio promptly stormed into the meeting, sword drawn, making a public oath that he would never abandon the Republic, and forcing all present to do the same. However, before getting to all of this, it's time for some important shoutouts, as I have the immense pleasure of welcoming Jim Walsh, Nicholas Weaver, and Jeff B. as the newest additions into the ranks of the Warlords of History Immortals. Thank you for supporting my efforts, with a wider thanks extended out to all the existing Immortals for your ongoing support of the Warlords of History podcast through either Patreon and PayPal, the links for which can be found on the support section of the Warlords of History website. Now, quick reminder that this episode makes for part 5 of the series on Scipio Africanus. So, if you haven't had a chance to yet, you might first want to have a listen of parts 1 through 4 before listening to this one, so that you have all the relevant background leading up to the events and people that we'll be covering off in this installment. But nonetheless, here's a brief summary of what we covered in the last episode to help bring you up to speed. Where we started with Hannibal, leading his army in an incredibly difficult march from the Po Valley through the Apennines and disease-ridden Arno marshes to force their way into central Italy, the region known as Etruria, before conducting another of his deadly symphonies, the withering ambush and annihilation of the Roman forces at the Battle of Lake Trasimene in June 217 BC. Which, in combination with his earlier, overwhelming successes at the battles of Ticinus and the Trebia in 218, added to the increasingly terrifying signs observed by the Romans in the natural world around them, interpreted as the gods being greatly displeased with the people of the Republic, sparking a frenzy of religious efforts in Rome that Scipio, as a priest of Mars, would have also been involved in, to restore the favor and protection of the gods from the ongoing Carthaginian menace and expected siege of their city. A siege that never materialized, that we know was due to more practical reasons. Hannibal facing two nagging, ongoing challenges to keep up the energy behind his campaign: ready access to food and troop reinforcements. Since, unlike what happened with Rome's Gallic allies in the Po Valley, despite the grievous setbacks so far, Rome's allies in central Italy showed themselves unwilling to vault over to Carthage's side, acting as a considerable blow to Hannibal's overarching campaign strategy, aiming to weaken Rome by isolating it politically, thus driving the Carthaginian general further down the peninsula, looking to procure Rome's southern Italian allies, the Greek-founded settlements of Magna Graecia, conquered by Rome only 60 years prior. And while the terrible bleeding of Roman military strength was stopped for a short time through the latter half of 217 under the dictator Quintus Fabius Maximus, the Delayer, who developed the famous Fabian strategy, one of attrition and containment of the Carthaginian army, Roman frustration and impatience over the lack of immediate results soon won out, further illustrative of a key problem within the Republic's military structure and methods, that, while possessing many capable commanders, it also consisted of just as many other generals that were dangerously unskilled from a tactical standpoint, hot-headed and imprudent, habitually blundering and misusing the legions. Beyond this, only versed in Rome's traditional, head-on approach to warfare, which, after casting aside the Fabian strategy, the Republic returned to in early 216 BC, but on an epic scale, aiming to crush the Carthaginian threat once and for all, levying an unprecedented army of 86,400 troops, including the 20-year-old Scipio, appointed as the youngest of the military tribunes within this monumental force that was led out from Rome in June 216, marching towards Cannae, where Hannibal and his 50,000-plus veteran army awaited them. Bringing us to where we left everything off in the last episode, with Scipio marching along in the ranks of this incredibly large Roman army, towards late July 216 BC, arriving in the region of Upper Apulia, the southeastern lands of the Italian peninsula, or the heel of Italy's boot, today also known as Puglia. as a military tribune, responsible for overseeing his assigned legion like a hawk, regularly connecting with the centurions to ensure the fighting readiness and that discipline was being maintained among the regular troops, while also conveying the commands of the consuls for 216, who were co-leading this tremendous Roman force. Supreme command over the entire army alternating every other day between Scipio's father-in-law, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a distinguished veteran leader of some repute, and Gaius Terentius Varro, another of the Res Publica's fiery and impulsive leaders, who, although is said to have served rather admirably in several Roman military campaigns in the decade leading up to this point, notably in Illyria, it's worth pointing out that his reputation was built on that of his actions as a skilled soldier and officer, not as a general, this being his first time in a position of top command. And while both he and Paulus were well aware that half their army was made up of raw recruits, lacking in training and discipline, capable of only basic formations and maneuvers, the prevailing Roman belief, as expressed by Barry Strauss in his book Masters of Command, was that, although inexperienced, they expected to win through sheer force of numbers, and Rome was hungry for a war-winning move. But although aligned on the mandate, it appears even before departing from the Eternal City that there was already a deep divide between the consuls on how to achieve this, impacted by internal senatorial politics happening behind the scenes. In that, according to the ancient Roman historian Livy, in his seminal work, From the Founding of the City, whereas Varro was loudly bellicose, making it widely known that he intended to force a war-deciding battle as soon as possible, Paulus, a supporter of the recent dictator Fabius the Delayer, Paulus wanted to also undertake a more cautious approach to the Carthaginian problem. And interestingly, before leaving to the front, Fabius warned Paulus that he would be fighting two enemies in this endeavor, Carthaginian and Roman, in Hannibal and Varro. Nonetheless, with the two consuls in early June driven to lead their troops out from Rome, beginning the 400-kilometer march southeast to Cannae. However, again, underscored by an important point, in that, due to the length of time eaten up to put together yet another large mobilization through the initial months of 216, training time among the newly levied troops, accounting for over half of this enormous force, was severely cut short, falling woefully short of the 4-month training period typically afforded to newly raised legions. So why didn't they just take the time they needed to better prepare the entirety of the army? Well, this was largely as a result of Hannibal's aggressive prodding in the weeks and months prior, through the spring of 216 BC, pressing hard to evoke a preemptive Roman response, by viciously raiding and harassing the Roman colonies and allied cities in and around northern Apulia, topped off by taking control of an important grain depot at Cannae, in part motivated by the ever-pressing Carthaginian need for food, with Cannae's location also holding considerable strategic value, controlling access to the fertile grain fields deeper to the south. However, arguably, of secondary importance to what Hannibal was really trying to achieve here, given his spies in Rome feeding him valuable intel on the incredible size of the army that the Republic was amassing, in trying to force a premature Roman response and another set-piece battle before these recruits could be molded into a more coherent force. Knowing that if the Republic wanted to keep its allies and stave off further embarrassment, they would need to react quickly to these threats, a strategy that worked exactly as intended, coaxing this enormous Roman army to bear down on his location, 86,400 strong, with a roughly even split between Roman and allied troops, broken down as follows, consisting of an estimated 65,000 heavy infantry, 15,000 light infantry velites, and 6,400 heavy cavalry, also strengthened by numerous volunteers from among the Roman aristocracy, including former consuls, other magistrates, nearly 100 men of senatorial rank and their sons. Much of this group accounting for the cream of the crop of Roman heavy cavalry, known as the equites, loosely translated to the Roman Knights. That altogether arrived in the Aufidus, modern Ofonto River Valley in late July, where Hannibal and his Carthaginian army had been patiently waiting for several weeks. The total Punic numbers estimated at somewhere between 50 to 52,000, and with the Carthaginian general and his high command occupying the citadel of Cannae, positioned on a hilltop just south of the Aufidus River, giving them a far-reaching view of the surrounding landscape, hemmed in by the hills, several kilometers away to the north, south, and behind them to the west. However, when facing eastwards, from the Carthaginian encampment that lay just beyond Cannae, the valley flatlands, in the middle of which, cutting through, lay the winding Aufidus River, flowing all the way to the coastline, where the blue of the Adriatic Sea can be seen about 10 kilometers away. And in the sweltering heat of late July, the apex of summer in the region, where daily temperatures typically reach upwards of 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes higher, to nearly 40 degrees. In 216, this group watching as the massive Roman army entered the arena that Hannibal had pre-selected for the upcoming battle. And while Hannibal would have most certainly communicated to his officers what was coming for them, we can imagine personally witnessing this mass of Roman soldiers coming into view, dwarfing their numbers, would have been greatly unsettling to say the least. A notion strengthened by a famous story coming from the ancient Greek historian Plutarch in his work Parallel Lives, when he relates that one of the Carthaginian officers by the name of Gisco, upon seeing the sea of Romans coming into view, expressed amazement, tinged by slight dismay, to another Punic officer. Hannibal, overhearing the side comment, broke the mounting tension with a joke, saying, "What's more amazing still is that in all that multitude, not one of them is named Gisco," eliciting a laugh from his high command, underneath of which was a compliment, inferring that no Roman warrior was of a comparable caliber to Gisco, or any other Carthaginian for that matter. While on the other side of the valley, facing westwards, upon seeing the Carthaginian position, this drove Paulus and Varro to order 2 Roman encampments built, right across from one another, situated near the northern and southern banks of the Aufidus, both about 4 or 5 kilometers distance from Cannae. An important factor behind this, controlling vital access to water, especially considering the blaringly hot summer conditions. With Scipio and his fellow tribunes, beyond keeping watchful tabs on the training and discipline of their assigned legions, busily at work overseeing to the construction of the encampments, also ensuring the watering and other logistical needs of the camps and troops were being met, while awaiting further instructions from the consuls and higher-ranking officers, which immediately became a problem for them, since shortly after their arrival, Hannibal mirrored the Roman setup by ordering a second Carthaginian camp constructed across the waterway on its northern bank, opposite Cannae. 2 camps, from which his Numidian cavalry and light infantry began repeatedly striking out, harassing the Roman water-gatherers along both sides of the river. Scipio and the tribunes, receiving report after report of these lightning raids, undoubtedly witnessing them as well, very likely themselves taking part in the active measures to combat the Punic incursions, while urgently relaying this information up the chain of command to the consuls, in return receiving not much more than silence, due to the deteriorating relationship between Paulus and Varro, who were not working well together, bitterly divided on how to handle the rapidly evolving situation. As the Carthaginians continued to wreak havoc on the copious Roman demand and efforts to keep their enormous host watered under the hot summer conditions, in Hannibal's aim to apply continuous pressure, forcing the Romans to commit to a pitched battle, before its consuls awakened to the realization that it heavily favored the Punic game plan. Given the relatively flat landscape east of Cannae, that was exceptionally suited for Hannibal to exploit his distinct advantage in cavalry, the one area they outnumbered the Romans, possessing roughly 10,000 to the Roman 6,400 heavy horse, while the Aufidus River cutting through, forming two narrow plains, with hills to the north and south of the waterway, would limit the width of the Roman deployment, in particular its heavy infantry, neutralizing their vast numerical advantage, regardless of the side selected for the pitched battle. Realizations reportedly held by at least one of the two consuls, sparking public arguments between them, inflaming, as we know, what had already been a strained relationship to begin with. You see, because Paulus, as soon as arriving at Cannae, his veteran eyes envisioning the setup, from Polybius in his work The Histories, we come to learn that Paulus was not at all happy with the location, flat and treeless, and was opposed to attacking the enemy there on lands made for cavalry, arguing that they should instead lure the Carthaginians to fight on grounds where the battle would be decided by the infantry. And as a quick side note, his stance on the situation, also impacted by a peculiar weather phenomenon specific to the region in the summer that Hannibal would have most certainly taken into account, looking to exploit every advantage he could muster. That Patrick Hunt in his book Hannibal labels as the Libecchio, a seasonal wind pattern that blows northeastwards across the landscape, carrying with it dust and sand from Africa, that several ancient writers also assert the Romans would have been facing, not as a deciding factor in the upcoming battle, but was enough of a nuisance to play a contributing role. Whereas Varro, regardless to any such factors and Paulus's stance, remained incensed with any suggestions of delay, impatient to get on with it, having convinced himself that their numerical superiority, irrespective to the lay of the land, would propel them to win the day. So, for several days, unable to come to consensus, the vast Roman host simply stayed put, all the while being subject to sporadic Carthaginian raids, sparking numerous smaller-scale skirmishes between the two sides, as Hannibal continually pushed and coerced to get the Romans to commit to battle. Until August 1st, when Hannibal marched his army out in full array onto the plain to the north of the river, challenging pitched battle, a day in which Paulus held top command and, true to his beliefs, declined the invitation. However, was unable to prevent this fateful day from unfolding on the following day, when Varro took command, and before the sun had risen on August 2nd, ordered a red flag to be flown above his tent, signaling for the troops to prepare themselves for battle. Heedless to another warning from Paulus, stemming from none other than the Republic's sacred chickens. Remember them back from part 3 in the series? In what is widely considered by most historians to be fictional storytelling by Livy, a bit of hindsight bias, but too interesting not to include, because, it's never a good thing when the pesky sacred chickens show up and don't eat. Livy writes that, once Varro gave the command to start, Paulus himself wished to delay, upon learning that the sacred fowls had refused their sanction, promptly notifying his colleague, who was just setting forth with the standards from the gate, which did nothing to dissuade Varro from his intended course of action. And by the time dawn began to break overhead, from both Roman camps, outpoured approximately 76,400 of the army, to march out and begin forming up facing westwards on the plain south of the Aufidus, that was approximately 2.5 kilometers wide from the riverbank to the adjacent hills, with 10,000 of their number kept behind, stationed back in the Roman camp on the northern plain, where a smaller engagement would be fought, seeking to destroy the Carthaginian camp, spurring Hannibal to do the same, however, only able to leave a small defensive contingent at his northern encampment, perhaps 2,000 at most, while leading the rest of his troops to where the Romans were now assembling. On the Roman right flank, closest to the river, Paulus leading 2,400 Roman heavy cavalry, and Varro on the left, commanding 4,000 Roman allied cavalry, in the center of which was the consul from the previous year, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, and the former master of horse, Marcus Minucius Rufus, leading an astonishing 70,000 infantry, 15,000 velites, and 55,000 heavy. The geography, as intended by Hannibal, forcing the Romans to compress their heavy infantry formation, packing them in together much tighter than usual, prevented from deploying their maniples of men in the famous checkerboard formation. Since, as mentioned by David Potter in Origins of Empire, Hannibal knew that a Roman soldier stood, ideally, 3 feet or 1 meter from the men on either side, in front and behind him, which gave him the space he needed to wield his sword. But if deprived of this vital space, they would rapidly lose the ability to defend themselves, which, along with all the other aforementioned factors, perhaps forms the headlining reason why Hannibal had selected Cannae as the battle site, and why, according to Robert Garland in his book Hannibal, this forced the Roman infantry into a battle setup limited to 2 kilometers wide with a depth of between 50 to 75 ranks, constrained by the width of the plain, leaving only narrow spaces at the sides for the cavalry wings, and Varro's plan to attack the enemy head-on by presenting an impenetrable shield wall to steamroll their way over and crush their Punic foes. Alluding to the notion that we spent some time on in the last episode, the perpetual Roman frontal approach to warfare, unequivocally followed by many of its generals, lacking in adaptability, or perhaps better said as lateral thinking, belying Varro's strategy that, as ever, was structured on brutal simplicity, made worse by the fact that the Romans, collectively speaking, still hadn't fully learned their lessons from the previous encounters, whereas Hannibal certainly did, now completely aware of the legion's unforgiving frontal punching power, having previously broken through his infantry lines 2 times, that you might recall happened both at the battles of the Trebia and Lake Trasimene. However, with the Carthaginian commander taking these lessons to heart, and so, in addition to having selected battlegrounds to help constrain the Roman numbers, also forming up his army, in fact his whole battle strategy, in anticipation of the expected Roman frontal assault, placing 6,000 African, Gallic, and Spanish heavy and medium cavalry on his left flank, nearest to the river, under an officer by the name of Hasdrubal, facing Paulus and his 2,400 Roman heavy horse. And quick side note here, this being a different Hasdrubal to that of Hannibal's second youngest brother, who had been left in charge of Carthaginian Spain. Hannibal also positioning 4,000 Numidian light cavalry on the Carthaginian right, led by an officer called Ma'arbal, against Varro and his force of 4,000 Italian allied heavy cavalry. And finally, with Hannibal and his youngest brother Mago personally leading the Carthaginian center, where he knew his forces would be under immense pressure, trying to hold back the Roman infantry mass, so vital for making his whole battle plan work. Having thinned out his 32,000 heavy infantry to match the length of the Roman line, but with a unique, very purposeful configuration, placing 24,000 mostly Gallic and Spanish infantry filling out the center, with his 8,000 African heavy infantry split into two groups of 4,000 on both ends, interestingly, held slightly back from the main Carthaginian line. And as a quick aside, in case you're finding this layout difficult to envision in your mind, I'll be sure to include several schematics on the Warlords of History website, so you can get a better sense as to what this all looked like, and what would unfold from here on in. Though one question that might be coming to mind at this point is where was our central figure, Scipio, positioned amongst this sea of humanity? In full transparency, no one knows for sure, and although documented that he was indeed there, for reasons that will be made much clearer soon, I strongly suspect that he, and luckily I would add in, was stationed among the 10,000 Roman forces on the northern bank of the Aufidus, charged with attacking the Carthaginian camp. And while it's plausible that he could have been present in the main battle, Scipio's involvement in the smaller fight on the northern side of the Aufidus makes much more sense, given the cataclysm that would soon befall the Roman troops, that few would survive. In truly what would soon unfold to become one of the most horrific days in Rome's history, Rome's greatest military disaster, spiraling into even darker days ahead for the Republic, facing financial ruin, huge difficulties in replacing its tremendous manpower losses, and the visage of Rome's military dominance shattered, triggering the desertion of some of its Italian allies, and later on, foreign powers taking notice and piling on, leaving the Republic staring its demise right in the face. All stemming from Hannibal's incredible campaign thus far, his undeniable battlefield genius, the apex of which was now 6 hours away. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, before the Battle of Cannae began, in what must have been an incredible sight to behold. In all, an estimated 126,000 soldiers taking the field. The Romans, heavily armored, more uniform in appearance, solidified by its densely packed infantry center, presenting an imposing shield wall facing westwards, squinting their eyes, slightly obscured by the dusty winds of the Libecchio, standing in contrast to the fascinating array of opposing Carthaginian units facing eastwards, which, let's turn to Livy for his description of the Punic infantry. Gallic warriors that were more terrifying to look on than the others, because of the size of their bodies and the display they made of them, some fully naked, others from the navel up, with the Spaniards forming up wearing crimson-bordered linen tunics that shone with a dazzling whiteness, with Polybius specifying that many Carthaginians were also wearing the choicest Roman armor, taken from those that had fallen at Trebia and Trasimene, which, in particular for the more inexperienced Roman troops, would have been deeply unnerving, as was the noise before the battle, a trembling cacophony of sound, assailing the ears of everyone who stood there. From both sides, blood-curdling battle cries shouted out by the soldiers, swords being struck against shields, signaling horns and trumpets echoing out, while commanders roared out last-minute reminders and orders to their troops. And, without a doubt, all of this invoking fear, trembling, palpable fear, unsettling nerves, disturbing the pits of their stomachs, causing some to vomit, amongst involuntary releases of other human fluids, as adrenaline coursed through their veins, in the rising tremendous heat of the early summer day, causing sweat and body odor, intermingling with the other horrendous smells surrounding the soldiers, undoubtedly impacting everyone, but again, felt most pointedly by the least experienced, of which the Romans held many. The battle beginning with the light infantry, Hannibal calling for his 2,000 Balearic slingers and 6,000 javelin men to enter the roughly 1 kilometer space between the two armies, triggering the Romans to do the same, sending in their 15,000 velites, with the opposing light infantry skirmishers launching their projectiles into one another. Where, despite outnumbered nearly 2-1, it appears that the Balearic slingers played a significant role in leveling the numerical gap for the Carthaginians, due to their superior range and rate of fire, which led to a lengthy initial bout between the two sides, but nothing immediately conclusive before they separated. But that had given Hannibal and his brother Mago not only a screen, but also the time needed to modify the formation of the Carthaginian heavy infantry line. When the light skirmishers fell back, revealing his Gallic and Spanish troops, instead of in a long linear line, reformed into a billowing arc or crescent-shaped formation, bulging out towards the Roman infantry, almost as if presenting a target for them to point towards, and Varro ordering the trumpets to sound the Roman infantry advance. However, due to the changed Carthaginian formation, already this started to create some difficulties in maintaining the original width of the Roman lines, since their more inexperienced troops were placed on the sides of this vast column of men, leading to a slight narrowing or compression of the Roman center, given the target presented, with the lengthy Roman shield wall starting to morph into the equivalent to that of a human battering ram. While the Romans began nearing the apex of the Punic infantry arc, at the same time, the cavalries on both wings also surging forward to engage. On the Carthaginian left, nearest to the Aufidus River, Hasdrubal, charging out with his 6,000 heavy and medium horse to meet with Paulus and his 2,400 Roman heavy cavalry. At the same time, on the other side of the field, Varro personally leading the 4,000 Italian allied horsemen to attempt engaging with the equal-numbered Numidians, led by Ma'arbal. These expert riders and light skirmishers from North Africa, wheeling about in a seemingly chaotic series of charges, throwing their javelins in and then falling back again and again, too elusive to be pinned down by Varro's forces, unwilling to commit to a standstill fight. Since, yes, they weren't meant for that type of combat, but more so because they were purposely stalling, buying time. Whereas the cavalry clash closest to the river, with little space to maneuver, was something else entirely. In fact, the complete opposite of what was happening on the southernmost part of the battlefield. Again, another purposeful tactic from the Carthaginian commander, since, in addition to greatly outnumbering Paulus and the Roman right cavalry wing, Hannibal knew that his horsemen were of superior quality, proceeding to strike the first decisive blow of the Battle of Cannae, that Livy describes for us when he writes, "Then the Gallic and Spanish horse, which formed the left wing, engaged with the Roman right in combat very unlike a cavalry encounter, there being no room to move, for the river shut them in on one side and the ranks of the infantry on the other. Both parties pushed straight ahead, and as the horses came to a standstill, packed together in the throng, the riders began to grapple with their enemies and drag them from their seats. They were fighting on foot now, but sharp though the struggle was, it was soon over, and the defeated Roman cavalry turned and fled. The Roman losses there, extremely heavy, and of note, somewhere in the middle of that clash, Scipio's father-in-law, Paulus, struck in the face with a Balearic slingshot, horribly wounded, and although what few left of his cavalry had since fled, he bravely remained, joining with the Roman infantry. That, locked in the fierce battle happening in the center of the field, their formation unintentionally narrowed, further squeezing the tightly packed legions in the center of their mass, nonetheless began making headway, forcing the Carthaginian infantry back, with Roman swords stabbing and cutting through, raining down heavy casualties on the Gallic and Spanish troops. But not breaking them, Hannibal and his brother Mago, desperately straining to keep them from falling apart, though unable to hold back the Roman tide that proceeded to push through the outwards billowing Carthaginian arc, transforming it into an inwards curving arc. Imagine something like an elastic band being pressed inwards, in what could be described as a Carthaginian fighting retreat. An impressive feat, being that, had the Romans broken fully through there, this is where Hannibal could have indeed lost the battle, since, as put forward by Barry Strauss, whereas most forces would have folded under a blow as hard as the Romans had struck, Hannibal's army bent without breaking, despite the human battering ram steadily advancing deeper and deeper. The point at which everything started going terribly awry for the Romans, since, after decisively defeating the right Roman cavalry wing, Hasdrubal reformed the Carthaginian heavy and medium horse to lead them around the battlefield, all the way around the rear of the immense Roman army, to show up behind Varro and his heavy cavalry on the other side of the field, who had been attempting, unsuccessfully, to force the stubborn Numidians to fight. That upon seeing their Carthaginian heavy and medium comrades show up, finally gave Varro what he wanted. However, now caught between the two bodies of Punic horsemen, in the manner of a crushing vice, the result for Varro and his men was ruinous, with almost all of the Italian allied cavalry slain, and leaving the Roman army with no cavalry support, since Varro and only about 70 of his men managed to survive the encounter, fleeing the battlegrounds. That would later become a black stain on Varro's historical legacy, since the infantry battle was still fiercely raging on. Granted, now hours in, coming close to its brutal conclusion. Because, remember when Hannibal had originally set up his infantry formation, with the Gallic and Spanish troops in the center, and his 8,000 African infantry split into two groups at the far extremes of the line, but held slightly back? Well, those units, up to this stage, astonishingly, hadn't moved an inch from where they were at the beginning, and hadn't engaged in any combat thus far, staying fresh and ready, awaiting Hannibal's call. Even as the 55,000 Roman heavy infantry began passing them by, pressing ever forward, causing the inwards curving arc, made up of Gallic and Spanish warriors, to deepen by some distance, which became the most pivotal point in the infantry fight, because once Hannibal had learned that the Roman cavalry had been cleared from the battlegrounds, he called for the Gauls and Iberian troops to dig in, giving up no more ground to the Romans, and personally, alongside his brother Mago, order them to do the impossible task of holding the line against the Roman battering ram, fighting alongside and shouting encouragements under tremendous strain to hold back the legions of Rome that had essentially walked themselves into a double envelopment, suddenly assailed on three sides, since this was the moment when the awaiting African infantry were ordered into the melee, to begin tearing into the flanks of the Roman host, where they had placed their most inexperienced troops, that tried to turn about and face the Africans, but were easily pushed back by these veteran warriors, though with nowhere to go, resulting only in compressing the massive body of Roman infantry further, completely disrupting their formations and forward momentum. And it was around here that Polybius tells us Lucius Aemilius Paulus died in the battle, despite horribly wounded, and offered a horse by one of his guards to flee. In contrast to his co-consul's actions, Paulus declined, ordering his aide to go and tell the senators to fortify the city before the victorious Hannibal draws near, before throwing himself back into the fight, exchanging blows with the enemy while cheering on and exhorting his men. The final nail in the coffin for Paulus and the doomed Roman army, shortly afterwards appearing in the form of Hasdrubal and the Carthaginian heavy and medium horse, that after sweeping aside Varro's cavalry wing on the Roman left, amazingly reformed once again, riding to begin charging in, then dismounting and attacking at the rear of the vast Roman infantry host. The Numidians also following along, used to hunt down any of the Roman troops trying to escape. From what had earlier been a double envelopment, revised into that of a complete envelopment. Unbelievably, with what remained of the whole body of Roman infantry, now wholly boxed in, surrounded on all sides. What followed from there was nothing less than a catastrophic slaughter. An estimated 2 hours of butchery on an unparalleled scale, far outweighing anything the Romans had experienced before in a single battle, not just in terms of Hannibal's campaign thus far, but in the entirety of Rome's 537-year history to that point in time. And although debated, argued by many historians to be the worst loss it would ever suffer, and try as we might, impossible for us to understand the horrors, hopelessness, panic, and despair that would have overtaken the thousands of remaining Roman troops, seeing their compatriots mercilessly slain all around them. Any hope of escape removed. Only warriors of the Punic army everywhere they looked. Gauls, Iberian, Libyan, Balearic, Numidian, and Carthaginian. Resulting, although the numbers continued to be endlessly disputed, in total losses estimated at upwards of 50,000 Romans slain and nearly 20,000 taken prisoner, versus somewhere in the realm of 6,000 to 8,000 losses for the Carthaginians. In this battle that the ancient historian and professor John F. Lazenby once wrote that the Romans may have suffered higher casualties in a single day's fighting than any other Western army before or since. Perhaps only outmatched by the British losses on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in World War I, wherein the British Army incurred 57,470 casualties on July 1st, 1916. However, this battle, while comparable in terms of casualties, was fought over 2,100 years later, using modern weapons such as rifles, machine guns, and artillery. But with one of my favorite reflections on the Battle of Cannae coming from the military historian Theodore A. Dodge, who said, "Few battles of ancient times are more marked by ability than the Battle of Cannae. The position was such as to place every advantage on Hannibal's side. The manner in which the battle was fought is a simple masterpiece of battle tactics. The whole battle, from the Carthaginian standpoint, is a consummate piece of art, having no superior, few equal, examples in the history of war." And although in total, just about 15,000 Roman troops managed to survive and evade capture, at this point, under half, or 7,000, were scattered in small groups, fleeing the area around Cannae, with the only sizable Roman force remaining being the one involved in the smaller operation that had been happening at the same time along the northern bank of the Aufidus, where, as previously mentioned, I suspect Scipio had been positioned, along with 10,000 Roman troops tasked with taking the Carthaginian camp. Since it was primarily these troops, sprinkled in with only a few survivors from the main battle, that managed to make it back to the safety of the northern Roman camp. Polybius providing some insights as to how this unfolded, with the majority of that 10,000-strong Roman group proceeding to assault the Carthaginian camp. However, despite lightly defended, being a fortified position, this enabled the Carthaginians to put up a stubbornly valiant hours-long resistance. And that might have become a success for the Romans had it not been for the reinforcements that Hannibal had sent forth at the closing moments of the main battle. That resulted in 2,000 to 3,000 casualties for this collection of Roman soldiers, with the rest retreating back to the northern Roman camp, including some few survivors from the main battlegrounds that miraculously managed to make their way there as well, leaving, in all, around 8,000 troops behind the walls of the lone remaining Roman encampment by the time night fell on August 2nd. Which, going back to the story that we covered at the top end of this episode, is where Scipio and 3 other military tribunes were all that was left of the Roman military leadership, looking around at each other in stunned disbelief as the gravity of the disaster began to slowly weigh on them. And again, although we don't know exactly where Scipio was and how he fought during the Battle of Cannae, whatever his previous actions had been, they must have been notable. Because what can be said with much more confidence, according to Livy, was that he was well regarded and respected enough, despite being the youngest of the tribunes, to have been unanimously elected as the interim leader of the 8,000 troops therein. Moreover, that he would play an instrumental role in facilitating the evacuation of the remaining forces in a daring night escape. And although Hannibal had posted units nearby, around the lone Roman camp, keeping close tabs on the force trapped inside, ostensibly intending to kill or capture them the following day, further enhancing the impact of his already incredible victory, Scipio, anticipating their fate, began rallying the exhausted, wounded, and terribly demoralized troops, organizing their escape, waiting until the middle of the night when the Carthaginians, also exhausted from the previous day's events, would be slower to react. First, by sending out several smaller groups of Roman troops, most likely the quickest moving units, whatever remained of the cavalry and light infantry, groups that took off into the dark in several different directions, causing some of the Carthaginian units to head off in pursuit, providing diversions to the main breakout, with Scipio personally leading the bulk of the survivors out of the camp, making for the nearby Roman allied city of Canusium, laying approximately 20 kilometers due west from Cannae, and despite its surrounding farms and grain fields having earlier been ransacked by Hannibal's forces, was still well protected by its stout walls. However, being that the main Carthaginian army was blocking a direct path, given the lay of the land, I suspect that the most likely scenario here is that Scipio would have led them to the nearby hills and highlands flanking Cannae to the north, choosing a wide-looping westwards arc around the area. Upon exiting the camp, reportedly subjected to attacks from what remained of the Carthaginian forces, not let off by the earlier diversions. But with Scipio careful not to let his troops be drawn into a standing engagement, a fighting withdrawal being a better description, while driving his men at an aggressive pace to the aforementioned hills, inaccessible to Punic cavalry, and for any pursuing Carthaginian infantry hesitant to follow, perhaps due to their lack of numbers, familiarity with the landscape, and exhaustion. Whereas, fueled by fear and Scipio's leadership, this motivated the Romans to push far beyond the energy reserves to what exhaustion would normally dictate, slowly struggling their way through the wild vegetation and rough hilly terrain, en route towards Canusium, leaving Cannae behind as the sun began rising on the morning of August 3rd, where Hannibal, although well aware of their departure, chose not to send a more sizable detachment to give chase. Though had he somehow been able to foresee that Scipio was included in that group, the man that would not only play the headlining role in the reversal of Carthage's fortunes in the coming years of the Second Punic War, but would also be the one to finally best Hannibal himself, the Carthaginian general would have probably thrown everything he had to chase them down and lay siege to Canusium. But of course, there's no way he could have known that. But also because he had other priorities to attend to, with the daylight hitting the grounds of Cannae, revealing the grisly aftermath of his greatest victory to date. The bodies of nearly 60,000 men strewn about, carpeting the battlegrounds, the vast majority of these Roman and their Italian allies. Using their newly acquired Roman prisoners as slave labor, directed by Carthaginian troops wearing rags over their noses to reduce the stench assailing the nostrils of everyone as they conducted this most unbearable of tasks, sifting through the human wreckage and refuse, looking for survivors, while collecting weapons, armor, and other trophies from the Roman dead, uncovering horror upon horror as they went about the task, the remnants of last-minute primitive struggles and gruesome despair. Livy describing for us what was discovered in vivid, sobering detail. Here and there amidst the slain, the gory figures of Roman soldiers whose wounds had begun to throb with the chill of dawn, cut down by their enemies. Others baring their necks and throats, bidding their conquerors to end their suffering. Some despairing Roman troops found with their heads buried in holes they had scratched into the ground, heaping the dirt over their faces to shut off their breath. And the last detail, certainly not for the faint of heart, is what Livy tells us drew the attention of all, was a Numidian who was dragged out alive from under a dead Roman, but with a mutilated nose and ears, for the Roman, unable to hold a weapon in his hands, had expired in a frenzy of rage while rendering the other with his teeth. Also finding almost the entirety of the Roman high command and its officers annihilated, evidenced by the heap of gold signet rings collected from among the fallen aristocracy. Since, as Patrick Hunt recounts, not only had Aemilius Paulus perished, but other dead generals, including Servilius Geminus, consul for 217, and Marcus Minucius, the master of horse in 217, alongside 29 of the 48 tribunes, 80 Romans of senatorial rank killed, and more than 200 equites, the Roman knights. Which, in part, helps to explain why Scipio had initially been elected as the interim leader of the 8,000 troops back at the northern camp. And although undoubtedly incurring some losses during their clever night escape and flight, it appears that these were relatively minor, and over the next couple of days, enabling Scipio to successfully lead the bulk of his troops to reach the safety of Canusium, that welcomed the Romans in view of Hannibal and his Carthaginian army located so uncomfortably close by. This city becoming the rallying point for the other survivors. In all, approximately 12,000 Roman and Italian allied troops that collected there, wherein, due to his actions and leadership, despite the arrival of other tribunes and others of the aristocratic class, of note all of whom were senior to the 20-year-old Scipio, he was nonetheless again affirmed as their interim leader, energetically looking to the strengthening of Canusium's defenses, also sending scouting parties and communications across the Apulian landscape and to the nearby settlements, looking for any forlorn units, calling them to gather at Canusium. Soon also learning that the consul Varro was still alive, under whom a smaller group of 3,000 survivors had gathered, stationed at Venusia, 50 kilometers southwest of Canusium, who ordered Scipio to stay put, while Varro brought his group to join up there. And while waiting for Varro's arrival at Canusium, it was somewhere around this point that Scipio further entrenched his skyrocketing reputation, not only as a predestined future leader of the Republic, but also as a fierce loyalist and protector of Rome. As he busily dove into the business of doing what he could to reassemble the tattered Roman forces and strengthen their position at Canusium, word was brought to him of an impromptu meeting happening within the quarters that had been made available to the Romans, wherein, disheartened by the calamity that had happened days, perhaps no more than a week prior, the devastating events at Cannae, mourning their state as already dead, believing Hannibal's total conquest of the Republic now inevitable, just a matter of time. A collection of Roman nobles, along with some of the soldiery, began discussing desertion, where ships might be obtained to abandon Italy, and potential foreign kings that might welcome their service. Livy tells us that Scipio immediately dropped what he had been doing, responding to the informer that had brought him the news and a small group of men around him, ordering them to arm themselves and follow him at once if they wished to save the state. Before, without hesitation, striding off in the direction of the meeting, storming in and disrupting the proceedings that were still underway. As soon as he entered the room, drawing his sword from out of its scabbard and pointing it to the would-be deserters, according to Livy, saying, "I solemnly swear that even as I myself shall not desert the Republic of the Roman people, so likewise shall I suffer no other Roman citizen to do so. If I wittingly speak false, may Jupiter Optimus Maximus utterly destroy me, my house, my family, and my estate. I call on you to swear after these terms, and if any refuse, to let him know that against him this sword is drawn." Which caused the conspirators, quaking as though they beheld the victorious Hannibal, to all take the oath and deliver themselves into the custody of Scipio. Yet, beyond Scipio's timely intervention to prevent this desertion, asserting that against all odds Rome would rise again, the truth of the overall situation for the res publica was that their long-held status as the dominant power in Italy, in fact, the outlook surrounding the very survival of their state, was at a critical breaking point, as the aftershocks of the Battle of Cannae began rumbling across the peninsula. In part because, while Varro soon after arrived at Canusium, joining up with Scipio, who relinquished total command of the forces stationed there to the consul, giving Rome something resembling a consular army, in the realm of 14,000 to 15,000 troops. This battered and horribly demoralized force was the only thing in field standing against Hannibal and his still formidable Carthaginian army, numbering 43,000 strong. And once news of this reached Rome, rendering the stunningly dark realization that they were indeed at the precipice of collapse, staring their demise squarely in the face. Economically ruined, soon even facing food shortages, with state coffers having been scraped bare to build the largest army they had ever assembled, thrown at Hannibal, but had been proven woefully insufficient to stop the Carthaginian threat. Left utterly destroyed, with, unbelievably, over 50,000 of their troops now laying slain on the blood-drenched grounds of Cannae, and nearly 20,000 taken prisoner, with the Republic's image as an indomitable military power irrevocably shattered, affirming Hannibal, if ever questionable before this point, now firmly situated as the greatest threat that Rome had ever faced, through his spectacular campaign, propelling Carthage for now to supplant the Roman Republic as the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean. In the next episode, we'll pick things up from here, with Hannibal as Rome's greatest threat, not just for his recent monumental victory, but more so what happened in the wake of the Battle of Cannae, with many cities in southern Italy promptly casting off their allegiance to Rome and signing alliances with Hannibal, followed by another surprising defection from the second largest and most influential Italian city after Rome, Capua. Political setbacks heaped upon the already stunned Roman Republic, struggling under bankruptcy, food, and manpower shortages. Yet, with Hannibal finding the Senate fiercely defiant to his overtures to negotiate peace, declaring they would accept only all-out victory or nothing, going to extreme measures to raise more armies, including freeing slaves and criminals to build new legions, and with the errors of their previous ways now finally learned, reverting back to the Fabian strategy, which is around the time Scipio would have returned to Rome, later returning to civilian life, leveraging his skyrocketing social credit to begin embarking on his political career. And although Rome's return to the Fabian strategy prevented any further military disasters from occurring in Italy, the political fallout from all their earlier losses and the domestic defections were topped off in the following year, in 215 BC, by foreign powers then entering the conflict, Macedon and Syracuse, forming alliances with Hannibal, each looking to use this opportunity to pick the domains of the Republic apart. This as Carthage, eager to press their advantage, sent reinforcements to Hannibal, alongside invasion forces into Sicily and Sardinia, with Rome perpetually on its back heels for the next years, but doggedly fighting tooth and nail to regain its footing. The only bright spot for Rome being its campaign in Hispania, under Scipio's father and uncle, Scipio Senior and Gnaeus, that for 7 years, since 218 BC, had made impressive inroads, before coming to a crashing halt in 211, when both were killed in battle. The point at which the 26-year-old Scipio volunteered himself, when no one else would, to gain his first command. This and more to come in the next episode of the Warlords of History podcast. And in the meanwhile, if you want to support the podcast, there are many ways you can help. You can tell your family and friends about the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you happen to access the show on. You can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And lastly, you can head on over to the show's website, warlordsofhistory.com, where on the support section of the site, you can find the show's Patreon or PayPal links in the event that you want to contribute to the podcast directly. But beyond this, where I'll include some additional info, like images and maps pertaining to this episode for your viewing pleasure, and where you can also reach out to me with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Theme music from audionautics.com.